It begins not with a battlefield, nor the thunder of tanks across Europe, but with the silence of sealed folders, their pages stained by decades of dust and secrecy. In forgotten vaults beneath Berlin, Moscow, Washington, and Bern lie fragments of stories that were never meant to be told. They are not the victories paraded in history books, nor the well-known tragedies that etch themselves into public memory. These are the hidden files. Classified operations, erased experiments, and quiet pacts written in ink too dangerous for daylight. They speak of convoys that vanished into the Arctic mist without leaving a trace, of Balkan valleys scorched by weapons that never appeared on official inventories, of poisoned wells in the heart of Manchuria where villagers perished in silence, and of clandestine negotiations carried out in neutral capitals as the Third Reich collapsed. Every file is scarred with omissions, pages ripped out, names redacted, photographs deliberately blurred. Yet within the fragments remain clues, enough to reconstruct shadows of the truth. What unfolds is not conspiracy, but history at its most unsettling. Events deliberately concealed by those who claim to preserve order in the post-war world. This is not about what was fought openly, but what was buried deeply, where silence was enforced with threats, and evidence was hidden in archives that remained locked for generations. Tonight, we unseal those files. We trace the outlines of the forbidden history that no government, no army, and no intelligence service ever wanted the public to know. Chapter 1. The Ghost Convoy of Narvik Fjord. In the frozen expanse of Norway's northern coastline, history hides more than the scars of invasion and retreat. Among the fjords, where mountains plunge into black water and the aurora bends across the night sky, an enigma lingers in silence. The Narvik Fjord, site of brutal naval clashes between German destroyers and Allied warships in 1940, holds a deeper mystery concealed in classified German and Allied records. It was here, in the late winter of 1942, that the Kriegsmarine initiated an operation that has never been officially acknowledged. Known in fragmented files as Convoy Grau, the Grey Convoy, this operation was not a supply line in any conventional sense. It was a movement shrouded in silence, its purpose bound to secrecy, even from much of the German command structure. Only fragments of intercepted Enigma transmissions, buried reports, and eyewitness testimonies give us a glimpse into what transpired across those Arctic waters. The convoy departed Kiel under blackout orders in February 1942. The ships, a mix of small freighters and modified trawlers, sailed without the usual Kriegsmarine insignia. Their holds carried no coal, no oil, and no artillery. Instead, crates stamped with the Reichsadler and the initials AH were loaded under the watch of SS officers wearing plain uniforms. These crates, later referenced in decrypted Bletchley traffic as Cargo 77, were described as strategically sensitive. Yet even within decrypted files, references were fragmented, with long strings of text replaced by unexplained redactions. It was as though the operation had been partially erased even before it concluded. British analysts flagged the intercepts as anomalous, but the relevant summaries were sealed by Whitehall and placed under restricted most secret categories, never to be declassified in full. On the icy waters north of Trondheim, the convoy encountered its first threat. A Royal Navy submarine, HMS Celian, reported visual contact with unmarked vessels moving in formation. Its log recorded a peculiar detail. The ships carried no navigation lights, even in hazardous waters. Celian prepared to fire torpedoes, yet before it could engage, the convoy abruptly vanished into heavy fog rolling from the fjord. Subsequent searches failed to locate the ships. Days later, however, fragments of wireless traffic were intercepted between Kriegsmarine Command in Kiel and an unnamed Arctic station, suggesting the convoy had reached Narvik Fjord intact. The transmission spoke cryptically of cargo transferred and final directive executed. Allied records contain no further references. Celian's log was quietly filed away, and its officers ordered to refrain from further comment. Norwegian resistance fighters stationed in Narvik reported unusual sightings during this period. One surviving testimony taken decades later described trucks moving by night with guarded crates, escorted not by Wehrmacht, but by men who refused to speak. Another account spoke of an abandoned freighter discovered half submerged, its decks empty, with no crew aboard. What made the testimony chilling was the detail that all logbooks, maps, and instruments had been stripped. leaving only scorched traces of paper in the captain's cabin. It was as if the ship had been cleansed of identity. The Norwegian resistance passed the report to London, yet the file was archived under restricted seal and never entered into official war histories. By March 1942, the convoy had dissolved into myth. Some of the freighters were reported sunk during Allied air raids. Yet when Royal Navy divers examined wrecks in Narvik's harbour after the war, they found the cargo holds empty. Not a single crate remained, despite the risk and secrecy surrounding their passage. The mystery deepened in 1944 when Soviet naval patrols reportedly located a scuttled German freighter in the Fjord's depths. According to later accounts from Russian divers, the ship bore unusual welding modifications around its cargo bay, as if reinforced for containment. When they breached the hold, they found only empty supports, the cargo long removed. The Soviet report, filed under Smersh archives, was stamped with the phrase, "Material transferred, do not disclose." It has never resurfaced. What was the nature of Cargo 77? Speculation ranges from stolen art and gold reserves to experimental weapons or biological material. Yet the evidence suggests something more troubling. Surviving documents from the Reich Main Security Office make passing reference to Arktische Einrichtung, an Arctic installation connected with long-term directives. These phrases appear only in relation to high-level SS operations, the type later revealed to have involved secret research and weapons development. Why transport such material into the unforgiving Arctic? One possibility raised by declassified fragments is that the Nazis sought a site beyond Allied bombing range, where work could continue undisturbed. Another theory, considered too dangerous for official discourse, suggests a transfer point for technology later pursued in Cold War programs. The Allied silence surrounding Convoy Grau raises further questions. Bletchley Park, so meticulous in documenting routine naval traffic, left vast gaps in its files on the convoy. Surviving analysts from Hut 8 later admitted in oral histories that orders had been given to cease correlation on intercepted traffic concerning Arctic cargo. Similarly, after the war, British archives declassified thousands of pages related to Norway, but excluded documents explicitly tied to February 1942 convoy movements. When Norwegian researchers petitioned for access in the 1970s, they were informed that records do not exist. Yet at least one index card from the British Admiralty, recovered in 1993, referenced File 77, Narvik transfer, listed as destroyed in 1951. On the German side, the trail is equally fractured. Surviving Kriegsmarine logs from Kiel make no mention of the convoy's departure. Yet fuel requisition reports for February 1942 contain a line item for unscheduled Arctic deployment, quantities inconsistent with normal patrol activity. The SS Economic and Administrative Main Office, responsible for logistics, recorded an unusual delivery of sensitive cargo, no manifests, during the same week. All related documentation ends abruptly, as if erased from the chain of record. Post-war interrogations of captured German officers revealed nothing. Most claimed ignorance. Only one, a junior signals officer named Hans Keller, spoke of a convoy without identity that departed under orders directly from Berlin, bypassing naval command. The silence that followed the convoy's disappearance was not accidental. As the Cold War deepened, fragments of the story resurfaced in unexpected places. A 1952 CIA memorandum, declassified in part, referenced possible transfer of German materials via Narvik 1942, destination unclear. The memo concluded that further inquiry not advised. In the Soviet Union, naval officers who had investigated the scuttled freighter were reassigned abruptly, their reports sealed. Even in Norway, official war histories excluded references to the convoy, despite resistance fighters insisting their reports had been forwarded. It was as if an unspoken agreement bound the victors to silence. Today, the waters of Narvik Fjord remain calm, reflecting only the jagged peaks that rise above them. Yet divers who have explored its depths still speak of wrecks stripped bare, ships that appear deliberately scuttled, their identities erased. The Ghost Convoy remains an open wound in the historical record, an operation carried out in secrecy, erased by both sides, and remembered only through fragments of testimony and classified hints. Convoy Grau, Cargo 77, the Arctic transfer, all names that mark the shadow of something larger, something never acknowledged. The fjord holds its silence, but the records, scattered, redacted, buried, suggest a truth that no one was willing to admit. The ghost convoy of Narvik Fjord was real, and its disappearance remains one of the most unsettling secrets of the Second World War. Chapter 2: Operation Iron Wolf in the Balkans. The winter of 1943 in the Balkans was a season of smoke, ash, and betrayal. Yugoslavia, already fractured by German occupation, Italian withdrawal, and the brutality of the Ustaše regime, became the stage for an operation so concealed that even Berlin's own high command never committed it to open record. The Gestapo labeled it only as Action Eisenwolf, Operation Iron Wolf. Surviving files, scattered between OSS archives in Washington and Soviet intelligence dossiers in Belgrade, describe an effort not merely of counterinsurgency, but of weapon transfer, ethnic cleansing, and clandestine testing. It was conducted in the shadows of the Dinaric Alps under the command of SS Obergruppenführer Ernst Kaltenbrunner, though his name appears only in coded references. The files bear a chilling uniformity. Villages erased without trace, partisan units reporting annihilation without artillery, and survivors whispering of a valley sealed off by the Reich as Test Zone Vuk, Wolf Zone. The context of the Balkans at this time was chaos sharpened to a knife's edge. Tito's partisans were expanding their operations, pushing deeper into occupied zones, drawing blood from German garrisons and puppet militias. The Wehrmacht, stretched thin by commitments in the east, relied increasingly on local auxiliaries, the Ustaše in Croatia, the Chetniks in Serbia, forces motivated by ideology and vengeance as much as loyalty to Berlin. Into this cauldron of competing militias and collapsing alliances stepped the Gestapo, intent not only on suppression but experimentation. Operation Iron Wolf was drafted under Gestapo File No. 17, preserved in fragments at the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz, its remaining pages stamped vernichtet, destroyed, though some microfilm copies escaped the purge. The operation began officially on January 12, 1943, with the sudden evacuation of several mountain villages in the Lika region. German and Ustaše units arrived at night, surrounding homes, giving families less than an hour to leave. Witnesses recalled trucks marked not with Wehrmacht insignia, but with the black wolf's head of an unrecognized unit. Entire populations were herded into makeshift camps, while their villages were burned. Yet no artillery shells were fired, no mortars deployed. Survivors later told of sudden eruptions, homes collapsing inward, livestock dead without wounds, wells tainted overnight. The destruction was total, and it bore no resemblance to standard counterinsurgency tactics. What made it more chilling was the silence of the soldiers. They did not gloat, did not shout. They carried out their task, with the precision of men sworn to secrecy. American OSS reports, preserved in the Donovan papers, noted intercepted radio transmissions from Zagreb referring to Vuk zone deployment successful. The intercepts included a chilling phrase, "Results confirm reliability of transport medium." Analysts at the time could not decipher the meaning, but later comparisons with Soviet files suggest a connection to chemical or incendiary tests. In a 1961 debriefing, a former Yugoslav partisan commander described a valley where the earth itself seemed poisoned, where vegetation failed to grow years after the war ended. He recalled comrades entering the zone only to fall ill within hours, their skin blistered without visible burns. No official Allied record corroborated his story, yet fragments of Soviet NKVD reports dated 1945 mention collapsed tunnels with rail equipment unsuitable for coal transport. The reports concluded, evidence of testing installation, sealed by explosive charges, no recovery possible. The Ustaše militia played a central role in Iron Wolf. For them, it was an opportunity to pursue ethnic cleansing under the cover of German science. Villages marked for testing were often Serbian Orthodox, their residents deemed expendable. Surviving testimonies from Croatian villages describe German officers arriving with Ustaše escorts, selecting sites, and marking wells with chalk before the evacuations. Days later, entire valleys were reported cleared, yet no battles occurred. No resistance was recorded. It was as if the earth itself had consumed those who remained behind. When survivors returned after the war, they found nothing but blackened stones and tunnels sealed with concrete. By spring 1943, partisan intelligence had intercepted fragments of coded radio traffic referencing Transport Wolf. Tito's operatives deduced that German forces were moving equipment through mountain passes under unusually heavy guard. The partisans mounted an ambush near the Velebit range. They expected supply convoys, trucks of weapons or fuel. Instead, they discovered long rail-mounted containers, too large for ordinary munitions, escorted by SS troops who fought with desperate ferocity to prevent their capture. The ambush succeeded in destroying part of the convoy, but the containers detonated with an unnatural fire, incinerating forest land without spreading in natural patterns. Surviving partisans reported that the flames did not burn outward but downward, consuming soil and stone as if drawn into the earth. No debris was recovered. The Germans immediately sealed off the area, executing civilians and posting units to prevent access. What remained was officially declared a restricted military zone. When questioned by Wehrmacht officers, Gestapo envoys offered no explanations, only orders. The zone was under direct Reich Security Command, not subject to army oversight. Such was the power structure of the late war. SS and Gestapo operations ran parallel to, and often above, conventional military authority. When the Allies advanced into the Balkans in 1945, traces of Iron Wolf were buried beneath collapsed tunnels. British units entering Croatia discovered areas where entire valleys had been sealed by dynamite. They found scorched railbeds leading into mountain faces, ending abruptly at walls of concrete. The tunnels were so heavily collapsed that engineers deemed excavation impossible. A few items were retrieved: twisted rail fragments, corroded machinery, but nothing definitive. The official British report filed under the Special Operations Executive concluded only evidence of non-standard German testing facility. Purpose unclear. Recommend silence. The file was classified and archived. It was never mentioned again in official post-war histories. The Soviets, however, pressed deeper. Smersh units operating in Yugoslavia documented the same tunnels, recording traces of chemicals in nearby water sources. Their reports, later uncovered in the 1990s, described livestock carcasses buried en masse, bones showing signs of chemical burns. The Soviets sealed their findings, transferring them to Moscow under biological and chemical warfare files. The conclusion was brief, chilling, and unambiguous. Operation Eisenwolf confirmed. Test zone Vuk abandoned. Allied silence, intentional. The post-war years buried Iron Wolf beneath layers of geopolitical necessity. The Allies, eager to stabilize Yugoslavia and prevent Soviet dominance, avoided mention of atrocities that implicated both German science and local collaborators. Washington, London, and Belgrade all benefited from silence. Survivors' testimonies were dismissed as exaggeration, while villages erased during Iron Wolf were written off as casualties of partisan warfare. Only fragments, OSS reports, Gestapo microfilms, Soviet files, remain to suggest the scale of what occurred. What was tested in the Balkans during those months of 1943 remains unknown. Theories range from early incendiary compounds to biological dispersal systems, but no definitive evidence has survived. What is clear is the pattern: villages evacuated, wells poisoned, valleys scorched, tunnels sealed, and always the presence of crates transported under the codename Wolf. Whether those crates carried weapons, experimental chemicals, or prototypes of technologies later adapted by Cold War powers, their passage left a scar still felt in the land. Test Zone Vuk remains closed, its soil said to resist cultivation even today. Operation Iron Wolf was not a conventional military action. It was an experiment conducted in occupied territory, on expendable populations, under the supervision of Gestapo officers, whose names never appeared in ordinary rosters. It was a crime erased before it could be judged, a file burned before it could be read. And yet, in the silence of Yugoslav valleys and the fragments of declassified pages, the truth still breathes. In the winter of 1943, under the shadow of the Dinaric Alps, Germany's war machine tested weapons that history has never dared to acknowledge. Chapter 3: The Poisoned Wells of Manchuria. In the bleak winters of Japanese-occupied Manchuria, where the icy winds swept down from Siberia and the earth froze hard beneath starving villages, a hidden war was waged not with guns and bombs but with water itself. Unit 731, the notorious biological warfare division under the command of General Shiro Ishii, has become synonymous with human experimentation, vivisection, frostbite trials and plague bomb testing. Yet among the suppressed files of Chinese intelligence and long-sealed Soviet archives lies an even darker chapter, one rarely spoken of in post-war discourse: It was codenamed the Poisoned Wells, and unlike the horrific but controlled laboratory experiments that defined Unit 731's infamy, this campaign was deployed on the open land, against unsuspecting villages, and under the mask of disease. It was not science for science's sake, but the deliberate eradication of entire communities, carried out as live field testing of bacteriological warfare. The first references appear in a suppressed Chinese report dated January 1942. The document, marked highly sensitive and signed by officials in the nationalist government in Chongqing, detailed sudden outbreaks in remote farming regions near Harbin. Cholera and anthrax spread with unnatural speed. Entire villages reported sickness within hours of drinking from communal wells. Survivors spoke of Japanese soldiers arriving days before, unloading sealed ceramic canisters, fragile as porcelain, that were lowered into water supplies under the cover of darkness. These containers, developed in Harbin's laboratories, contained pathogens cultivated with precision. Unlike bombs dropped from aircraft, which scattered bacteria unevenly, these well poisonings were systematic. Once the canisters dissolved, they released concentrated disease into the very veins of rural life. The scale of the operation becomes clearer in Soviet interrogation records from 1945, when the Red Army captured Japanese officers after the fall of Manchuria. Under codename Hibiki, one officer confessed to participating in waterborne operations. He described riding with mobile teams disguised as engineers, escorted by Kempeitai military police. Their mission was to sanitize wells, though in reality, they infected them. According to his testimony, entire regions were mapped, with wells selected for their centrality to village survival. He recalled one chilling directive: "The water must carry our work into every household." His confession was sealed in Moscow, classified under special folder, and not released until the collapse of the Soviet Union decades later. American intelligence, too, knew more than it admitted. After Japan's surrender, US occupation authorities in Tokyo gained access to Ishii's archives. They discovered references to rural dispersal experiments, with field data documenting mortality rates in Manchurian villages. Instead of prosecuting Ishii and his staff, US authorities struck a bargain: immunity in exchange for scientific data. Reports on the poisoned wells were quietly shipped to Fort Detrick, Maryland, where the US Army's Biological Warfare Division studied them. The files never saw daylight, but fragments have surfaced. Notations of village mortality 100%, references to well saturation technique, and chilling photographs of abandoned Chinese hamlets. Their wells sealed with crude planks, as if to hide the contamination below. For the people of Manchuria, the poisoned wells meant death without warning. Survivors' testimonies collected years later describe entire families succumbing within days. Livestock perished, crops rotted in the ground, and villages became ghost settlements. The sickness spread beyond the initial targets, carried by streams and rivers to neighboring communities. Chinese medical teams who attempted to investigate were overwhelmed, with doctors falling ill after sampling water. The infections spread with such precision that locals came to believe their water had been cursed. They buried their dead in shallow mass graves, marking the ground with stones that still stand today, unrecognized war memorials in frozen fields. What makes the poisoned wells uniquely disturbing is not only the scale, but the silence that followed. Unlike the bombings of Chinese cities, which left ruins visible to all, the poisoning of wells erased life quietly, leaving no dramatic wreckage, only absence. Entire villages vanished from census records. Maps from the 1930s list communities that by the 1950s no longer existed. When questioned, Japanese officials dismissed the disappearances as the result of famine, migration, or partisan warfare. Yet the classified appendices of both Chinese and Soviet archives told another story: targeted extermination carried out under the guise of epidemiological outbreaks. The winter of 1941-42 marked the height of these operations. The Japanese Kwantung Army, overstretched and desperate to maintain control of Manchuria's vast territory, authorized Unit 731 to conduct suppression through biological means. Codenamed Project Maruta Expansion, this directive broadened the scope of experimentation beyond laboratories into the countryside. Hibiki's testimony confirmed that at least 30 villages were targeted. In one case, villagers were herded into a central square by Japanese troops, ostensibly for medical inspection, while engineers slipped into their wells. Within 2 days, half the population was dead. Survivors recalled soldiers returning with notebooks, recording symptoms, as if observing livestock rather than human beings. Soviet medical examiners who entered Manchuria in late 1945 uncovered further evidence. They exhumed corpses from mass graves, noting lesions and internal damage consistent with cholera and anthrax. Their report, submitted to the Khabarovsk War Crimes Tribunal, contained details of water contamination programs, though much of this evidence was excluded from the public record. The tribunal, though significant, was overshadowed by the Tokyo trials, where American prosecutors deliberately suppressed biological warfare charges to protect Ishii. The Soviet report was filed away, its pages stamped "not for dissemination," ensuring that the poisoned wells would remain hidden for decades. The physical remnants of these crimes persist. In rural Manchuria, wells sealed during the war remain untouched, avoided by locals who still whisper of their poison. Some are overgrown, choked with weeds, others covered by makeshift lids of rusted iron. Chinese archaeologists who examined one such well in 1984 discovered ceramic fragments matching descriptions of Unit 731's dispersal canisters. Soil samples revealed traces of pathogens, though degraded by time. The findings were quietly filed in provincial records but never broadcast publicly. Deemed too inflammatory for Sino-Japanese relations during a period of fragile diplomacy, the human toll of the poisoned wells is incalculable. Unlike documented massacres where numbers can be tallied, these deaths disappeared into the fabric of disease and war. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, perished anonymously, their deaths attributed to outbreaks in wartime records. Families vanished, lineages extinguished without recognition. The true legacy is one of silence. Villages erased not only from the earth but from memory. Their suffering traded for scientific data in secret deals that shaped Cold War research. Even today, historians attempting to reconstruct this chapter face barriers. Japanese archives remain incomplete, many records deliberately destroyed. American files at Fort Detrick remain classified, citing national security. Soviet documents, though partially declassified, remain fragmented, with crucial appendices missing. Chinese local records, often destroyed in subsequent conflicts, offer only ghostly hints. What remains is a patchwork of testimonies, redacted reports, and the silent wells themselves, standing as mute witnesses to atrocities never fully acknowledged. The poisoned wells of Manchuria remind us that war crimes are not always marked by explosions or ruined cities. Sometimes they seep quietly into the veins of a people, leaving no smoke, no rubble, only silence. It was a crime buried by victors and vanquished alike, sealed not only in the frozen soil of Manchuria, but in the classified archives of three great powers. And yet, in the frostbitten fields where villagers once drew water, the echoes of their suffering remain, waiting for history to break the silence imposed upon them. Chapter 4: The Secret Pact of Bern Station. In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed under the weight of Allied advances from west and east, a different kind of battle unfolded, not with artillery or tanks, but with whispered negotiations, coded telegrams, and unmarked train carriages sliding into neutral territory. Deep within the files of the Office of Strategic Services in Washington and fragments of Gestapo correspondence smuggled out of Germany, there exists evidence of a clandestine agreement reached in neutral Switzerland. It became known, in whispers only, as the Pact of Bern Station. Though never acknowledged in official post-war histories, its existence explains how certain Nazi officials, scientists, and intelligence assets slipped past justice and re-emerged within the structures of Cold War power. The pact was not written on parchment or signed in daylight, but carried in the shadows of Bern's train yards and within the soundproof offices of the OSS outpost stationed there. The central figure in this hidden drama was SS General Karl Wolff, chief of personal staff to Heinrich Himmler and higher SS and police leader in Italy. By early 1945, Wolff recognized the inevitability of Germany's defeat. He sought not merely survival, but relevance in the world that would follow. Acting through intermediaries, he reached out to Alan Dulles, then head of the OSS station in Bern. Their communications, preserved in part in the Dulles papers at Princeton, reveal coded references to meetings at the Schweizerhof Hotel, conducted under the cover of humanitarian negotiations for prisoner releases. Yet the content extended far beyond that. Wolff offered not only safe passage of Italian territory to Allied forces, but access to German intelligence files, scientific personnel, and even technologies under development in the Reich. The Allies, desperate to secure advantage against the Soviets, listened. Gestapo correspondence intercepted after the war confirms that Wolf's initiative was not entirely rogue. File fragments recovered from Gestapo headquarters in Berlin speak of Operation Sonnenklar, Operation Sunlight, authorizing negotiations with Allied representatives in Switzerland under strict secrecy. Himmler, perhaps hedging his own fate, allowed Wolf latitude to bargain. The pact that emerged in Bern, however, went beyond tactical surrender. It opened channels for the transfer of personnel and knowledge considered too valuable to lose, even if those who carried it were complicit in atrocity. Names appeared. Scientists associated with the V2 program, intelligence officers tied to Abwehr networks in the East, and specialists in fields ranging from cryptography to biological research. Many of these individuals, records suggest, were quietly extracted from Germany through neutral Switzerland before the war officially ended. The Swiss, ever pragmatic in their neutrality, facilitated without comment. Railway schedules from 1945 show anomalies. Late-night trains recorded as special transports with no listed cargo. Swiss border police logs note diplomatic clearances issued to unidentified convoys moving south toward Italy or west toward France. Witnesses recalled convoys of black automobiles arriving at Bern station under heavy guard, their passengers concealed by curtains. To the public, these movements were invisible. To the intelligence world, they represented the reshaping of post-war power. Bern became the pivot where the remnants of the Reich were bartered not for ideology, but for utility. Operation Sunrise, as the Allies publicly knew it, was presented as negotiations for German surrender in northern Italy. What remained hidden was the secondary layer, the Pact of Bern Station. OSS cables, declassified in fragments, contain references to special assurances given to Wolf and his associates. These assurances included immunity from prosecution, safe passage for families, and resettlement in Allied zones. In exchange, Wolf provided information on Soviet positions, details of underground fortifications in Austria, and access to networks that would later form the backbone of Western intelligence operations against Moscow. The CIA, which emerged from the OSS, inherited not only the files, but the personnel quietly funneled through Bern. The Soviet Union was not blind to these dealings. NKVD intercepts from Switzerland, preserved in Russian archives, reveal growing suspicion. One cable, dated March 1945, reported unusual frequency of American-German meetings in Bern and warned of separate arrangements that threaten Allied unity. Stalin himself confronted Roosevelt with accusations of betrayal at the Yalta Conference, though the full scope of his knowledge remains uncertain. What is clear is that the Soviets understood the implications. The West was securing German expertise and assets for the coming Cold War, leaving Moscow excluded. The bitterness of this realization shaped Soviet post-war strategy, deepening mistrust that would define decades of rivalry. The individuals who benefited from the Pact of Bern Station did not vanish. They resurfaced in laboratories, intelligence bureaus, and defense industries across the West. Some were absorbed into Operation Paperclip, the US program that imported German scientists. Others found quiet positions in Swiss and Italian institutions, their pasts obscured by new identities. Karl Wolf himself escaped the gallows, later serving only a token prison sentence before living comfortably in Bavaria until his death in 1984. His survival, and the survival of those he protected, stands as silent testimony to the secret bargain struck in Switzerland. Swiss archives hold tantalizing fragments. Banking records show sudden transfers in 1945. Accounts opened in the names of German nationals who vanished from post-war rosters. Real estate transactions reveal properties purchased under shell identities, later linked to individuals known to have served in SS research divisions. Yet requests to access the full archives are routinely denied, citing national security and diplomatic sensitivity. The Pact of Bern Station remains officially unacknowledged, its details buried under layers of classification that span not only nations, but alliances. For the ordinary soldier on the front lines, the war ended with surrender and liberation. For the victims of Nazi atrocities, justice was expected at Nuremberg. But for those with knowledge or expertise deemed useful, another path opened. One negotiated in the shadows of Bern's train yards, in the smoke-filled rooms of Swiss hotels, and in the cables exchanged between Allen Dulles and Washington. Justice was compromised, memory suppressed, And the foundations of Cold War intelligence were laid not only with Allied resolve, but with Nazi bargains. The Pact of Bern Station stands as one of the most unsettling truths of the Second World War. It demonstrates that even at the twilight of history's bloodiest conflict, the calculus of power eclipsed the demands of justice. Files marked restricted and destroyed cannot erase the fragments that survive, nor the unanswered questions they raise. Who else was spared through Bern? How much of the Cold War's shadow architecture was built on this unholy bargain? And why, decades later, do the archives remain closed? The truth guarded as tightly as it was in 1945. In the silence of Bern Station, history whispers its darkest secret, that the end of one war was already the beginning of another. As we close these files, their edges frayed with redactions and their truths submerged in silence, one theme emerges. What was hidden was never forgotten, only buried. The ghost convoy of Narvik Fjord remains a question mark etched across the Arctic seas, its cargo sealed beneath waves and secrecy. Operation Iron Wolf in the Balkans left valleys scorched and populations erased. Its tunnels collapsed, yet never silenced. The poisoned wells of Manchuria poisoned not only water but memory, extinguishing villages while governments traded justice for data. And the secret Pact of Bern Station ensured that knowledge born of atrocity was repurposed, not punished, laying foundations for a new global struggle. These stories are not conspiracy. They are fragments of documented history, concealed because their revelation would fracture the post-war order carefully constructed by victors. What else lies in unopened archives, behind seals marked "Destroy after review" or "Classified until 2050"? How many more names slipped through the cracks, finding protection in the very powers sworn to bring justice? The questions echo into our present, reminding us that history is not only written by the winners, but edited by them. These buried files force us to ask, if truth can be silenced for a century, how much of what we accept as history is only the surface of what was too dangerous to reveal? The deeper we dig, the darker the light becomes, and the closer we come to secrets still waiting to be uncovered.